The HOA sent me a $12,800 bill. One sentence exposed the trap. The first sound that morning wasn't a knock. It was my front gate rattling like somebody thought ownership was optional. I looked up from a broken fence post and saw 3 HOA SUVs waiting outside my ranch. Their president stepped forward, clipboard in hand, demanding an inspection of land she didn't own. Minutes later, she threatened fines, lawyers, and even the sheriff. What she didn't know was that my family owned 900 acres, every deed was documented, and one hidden secret tied to an old ranch road was about to turn her entire plan upside down. Stay with me, because what started at a locked gate ended with a question nobody in that HOA could answer. And before we get into it, if you enjoy stories about standing your ground with facts, patience, and a little common sense, take a second to subscribe. There's always another road, another deed, and another story waiting just around the bend. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't a truck engine. It was the metallic rattle of my front gate. Not a knock. Not somebody calling my name from the county road. A hard shake. The kind of shake that says the person on the other side already believes they belong there. I was halfway through replacing a broken fence brace near the entrance to my ranch when it happened. The post had split during a windstorm 2 nights earlier. I just set the new cedar brace in place and was tightening the last bolt when the chain rattled again. I straightened up and looked toward the road. 3 SUVs sat outside my gate. All of them clean, all of them expensive, all of them completely out of place on a Wyoming ranch road covered in mud and gravel. I recognized the white Range Rover immediately. Denise Whitaker, president of Cedar Ridge Estates. The woman had lived less than 2 miles from my property for 4 years and somehow managed to act like she owned half the county. I set my wrench on the tailgate of my truck and walked toward the gate. The iron chain hung across the entrance exactly where it always had. Behind me stretched 900 acres of pasture, timber, and rolling hills that had belonged to my family longer than Cedar Ridge Estates had existed. Denise stood waiting beside the gate. Perfect hair, pressed coat, clipboard tucked under one arm. 2 HOA board members stood behind her holding folders. One of them was already taking pictures. I stopped 10 feet inside the gate. "Morning," I said. Denise didn't return the greeting. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we're here for a property compliance inspection." I looked past her at the board member taking photos, then back at her. "You're here for what?" "A property compliance inspection." She said it like she'd practiced the phrase in a mirror. "We've received multiple complaints regarding visual standards violations visible from Cedar Ridge." I glanced around. My barn, my fencing, my hay storage, my livestock trailer, everything exactly where it had been for years. "What complaints?" "The barn requires review. The trailer is creating visual disruption. The hay storage is inconsistent with community standards." Community standards, that phrase alone almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I rested one hand on the gatepost and asked the question that mattered. Under whose authority? For a moment, nobody answered. One of the board members lowered his folder. The other stopped taking pictures. Denise smiled, not because she had an answer, because she thought confidence was an answer. Cedar Ridge Estates has a responsibility to maintain appearance standards affecting community property values. My ranch isn't community property. It affects community presentation. I looked down the road toward the stone entrance sign for Cedar Ridge. The subdivision sat behind manicured lawns, decorative fences, and rows of matching houses. My ranch sat outside all of it. Different parcel, different deed, different world. "That's interesting," I said, "because the county tax office seems to think this land belongs to me." Her smile tightened. "Mr. Mercer, cooperation would make this much easier." There it was. Not a request, a warning. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. Contractors, developers, government officials, people who wanted something, people who didn't like hearing no. The difference was that most of them had at least bothered to find out who owned the property first. Denise apparently had not. She took a step closer. We only need access to document compliance concerns. No. The answer came out flat. Simple. Final. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Denise blinked. I don't think you understand. No, I said. I understand perfectly. I pointed toward the chain stretched across the gate. That gate is locked. I pointed toward the ranch behind me. That land belongs to me. Then I pointed toward the county road. You're standing over there. The board member with the camera lowered it completely. Denise's expression hardened. Refusal to cooperate can result in enforcement action. What enforcement action? Fines. I nodded. Anything else? Attorney review. Anything else? She hesitated. Then she delivered the line she'd clearly been saving. If necessary, we'll involve law enforcement. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds, long enough for the wind to move through the pasture, long enough for a hawk overhead to scream somewhere beyond the ridge, long enough for me to realize she was serious, not mistaken, not confused, serious. She genuinely believed she could call the sheriff on a ranch owner standing behind his own locked gate. I looked directly at her, then at the clipboard, then at the board members, and finally back at Denise. My voice stayed calm, because calm makes people like Denise nervous. Denise, I said, I'm not even in your HOA. Nobody moved. The sentence landed harder than I expected. One board member slowly looked toward the other. The second board member lowered his eyes. Even Denise seemed caught off guard, only for a moment. Then she recovered. Adjacent properties may still be subject to review. No. We're reviewing impact zones. No, not community influence areas. No. Her jaw tightened. Those are recognized concepts. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not loudly, just enough, because I'd spent years managing county survey crews. I'd worked with plats, easements, right-of-ways, boundary disputes, access agreements, and property records. And in all those years, I'd never once encountered a legal document called a community influence area. What exactly are you reviewing? I asked. The approach corridor. The what? The approach corridor. I stared at her. The board members stared at her. Even they didn't look completely convinced. The truth was obvious. She was making it up as she went, adding words, adding authority, adding territory, trying to stretch HOA power across land that had never belonged to the HOA. When I didn't respond, Denise lifted her clipboard. We'll be documenting your refusal. Go ahead. We'll also be pursuing further action. Go ahead. Her face reddened. Not much. Just enough. The reaction of someone unused to resistance. Someone used to residents apologizing. Someone used to winning. Finally, she nodded. Very well. She turned toward her SUV. The board members followed. One of them glanced back at the ranch before climbing into the passenger seat. The vehicles pulled away a few seconds later. I stood there watching them disappear down the road. The chain on my gate swayed slightly in the wind. Still locked. Still mine. But something about the encounter didn't sit right, because Denise hadn't acted like someone making a mistake. She'd acted like someone following a plan. I walked back toward my truck. Halfway there, my phone buzzed. An email notification. Sender, Denise Whitaker, Cedar Ridge Estates, HOA. Subject: Notice of Property Non-Compliance. I stopped walking, opened the message, and felt my stomach tighten. Because attached to the email was a formal assessment notice. Not $50, not $500, $12,800. And somehow that wasn't the most troubling part. The most troubling part was a single sentence buried near the bottom. A sentence that made me realize Denise's visit had never been about my barn, never been about my trailer, never been about my hay storage. It was about something much bigger. And whatever she was trying to do, she had already put it in writing. I stood beside my truck and read the notice a second time, then a third. The amount sat near the top in bold letters. $12,800. Visual Compliance Assessment. The phrase itself was ridiculous. My ranch wasn't inside Cedar Ridge Estates. My property wasn't governed by Cedar Ridge Estates. And yet somehow their HOA president had decided she could issue a 5-figure assessment against 900 acres she didn't own. But the dollar amount wasn't what bothered me. It was the paragraph buried near the bottom. Small print. Easy to miss. The kind of language lawyers hide when they want people focused somewhere else. I zoomed in. Payment of this assessment shall constitute voluntary participation in Cedar Ridge exterior review procedures and acknowledgement of applicable community standards. I read the sentence twice. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was dangerous. The assessment wasn't a penalty. It was bait. If I paid it, Denise would have something much more valuable than $12,000. She'd have my signature attached to a payment. Proof that I had voluntarily participated. Proof that I had accepted review authority. Proof she could wave around later when questions started getting asked. The entire thing suddenly made sense. Not the details, not yet. But the strategy. I walked into the ranch house and spread the notice across my kitchen table. Beside it sat my property tax records, my deed, a county parcel map. I compared them anyway. Nothing had changed. 900 acres. Mercer Ranch. Recorded exactly the same way it had been recorded for decades. The phone rang before I finished. The caller ID showed a name I trusted. Grace Holloway. I hadn't called her yet, which meant somebody else had. Caleb. Morning, Grace. I just got off the phone with Earl Sutton. That surprised me. Earl Sutton owned the neighboring ranch east of mine. The man somehow knew everything that happened within 20 miles. What did Earl have to say? He said Denise Whitaker was at your gate this morning. I smiled. News travels fast. Earl saw the SUVs. Of course he had. There wasn't much that escaped Earl. Tell me exactly what happened. I did. The inspection demand, the threats, the sheriff comment, the assessment notice. Grace listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for several seconds. Then she asked one question. Did you pay anything? No. Good. Another pause. Then, do not pay it. Wasn't planning to. Do not sign anything. Wasn't planning that either. Do not email Denise without letting me read it first. Now that got my attention. You think it's that serious? I think she's trying to manufacture consent. The exact phrase I'd been thinking. I sat down. That's what it looks like to me. It looks that way because that's what it is. Grace's voice had changed. Calm, precise. The way lawyers sound when they're already building a case. Caleb, she's not acting like someone enforcing rules. Then what is she acting like? Someone trying to create jurisdiction. The room went quiet. I looked at the assessment again. The hidden paragraph. The voluntary participation language. the inspection demand. Every piece pointed in the same direction. Not enforcement, expansion, authority, control. But why my ranch? Grace didn't answer immediately. That's what we're going to find out. An hour later, I scanned every document Denise had sent. The assessment, the email, the attached photographs. Grace wanted everything. When I enlarged the photos, something jumped out immediately. They weren't documenting violations. They were documenting access points, the front gate, the gravel road, the cattle crossing, the main ranch entrance. Every photo centered on roads, not buildings. Roads. I sent the files anyway. By late afternoon, another email arrived from Denise. This one was shorter. Failure to cooperate may result in additional enforcement actions, attorney review, and community protection remedies. Community protection remedies. Another phrase that meant absolutely nothing. Yet there it was. Official letterhead. Official signature. Official sounding nonsense. The confidence almost impressed me. Almost. I forwarded the email to Grace. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed. One sentence. Do not respond. 10 minutes after that, she sent another. I'm pulling the original Cedar Ridge filings. Now I was interested. Because Grace didn't waste time chasing dead ends. If she was digging through formation documents, she had spotted something. The sun was setting by the time I finished securing equipment around the barn. The ranch was quiet again. But the quiet felt different now. Not peaceful, watchful, like the first move had already been made. I walked back toward the house carrying Denise's assessment notice. Before stepping inside, I stopped and looked toward the county road. The gate stood closed. The chain hung exactly where it belonged. Yet somehow Denise Whitaker had acted like that gate was temporary, like she already expected it to open, like she believed something gave her a right to cross it. And for the first time all day, one question started bothering me. If the assessment was a trap, if the inspection was a trap, if the sheriff threat was a bluff, then what exactly was Denise Whitaker really after? Because people don't risk lawsuits, county complaints, and public records disputes over barn paint. And deep down, I was starting to think she knew that too. Grace called at 6:12 the next morning. I remember the exact time because I was standing in the equipment shed reviewing inventory when my phone buzzed. Her first words were simple. How fast can you get to your father's records? That got my attention immediately. My father's records are already here. Good. You find something? I found enough to know Denise isn't freelancing. I stopped what I was doing. What does that mean? It means somebody spent time building this. The line went quiet for a second. Then Grace added, and I think your father anticipated something like it. 20 minutes later, I was sitting at the dining table with 3 boxes spread out in front of me. Most people saw paperwork. I saw 40 years of ranch history, tax receipts, boundary surveys, utility easements, county filings, every document my father had insisted on preserving. Growing up, I thought he was obsessive. Now I understood better. My father used to say something whenever neighboring landowners got into disputes. People don't steal land first. They steal permission. At the time, I thought it was one of those ranch sayings older men collected. Now Denise Whitaker had practically turned it into a business plan. I opened the first box. The deed sat exactly where I expected. Mercer Ranch. 900 acres. Recorded ownership. Nothing surprising. The second box held survey records dating back decades. Boundary confirmations. Road maintenance agreements. Access easements. Again, nothing unusual. The third box was different. It contained correspondence. Letters. Meeting notes. Development proposals. Documents that rarely mattered until suddenly they mattered a lot. I worked through them one by one. Then I found a folder labeled Cedar Ridge Development. My pulse picked up. The folder wasn't thick, only a handful of pages. But the dates immediately stood out. 30 years old. Long before Denise Whitaker ever arrived. Long before most of Cedar Ridge existed. I opened it. The first document was a proposal. A developer requesting access across Mercer property. The second document was my father's response. Denied. The third was even more interesting. A survey map showing proposed subdivision expansion. One route crossed directly through land that now belonged to me. I stared at it, then called Grace. "Tell me you're looking at the Cedar Ridge folder." She laughed. "I am. You've already seen this." "Last night." I leaned back in my chair. The pieces were starting to move. What exactly am I looking at? A pattern. I waited. Grace continued. 30 years ago, the developer wanted access through your ranch. He didn't get it. No. Then why does it matter now? Another pause. Because sometimes failed plans don't disappear. That answer stayed with me. The rest of the morning, I reviewed everything. Meanwhile, Denise kept working. Around noon, another email arrived. This one wasn't addressed directly to me. It was a Cedar Ridge community newsletter. Someone had forwarded it. The subject line read, "Preserving Community Standards." Attached was a photo of my barn, another of my trailer, another of my front gate. No name attached. No direct accusation. But everyone in Cedar Ridge would know exactly whose property they were looking at. The wording was careful. Adjacent properties can significantly impact community value and neighborhood presentation. Translation. Denise was building an audience. I forwarded the newsletter to Grace. Her reply came almost immediately. Save everything. I already was. By evening, I had created a dedicated folder. Emails, assessments, screenshots, photos, newsletters, every communication Denise sent, every claim she made, every contradiction. Because the more I reviewed the material, the less this looked like an HOA dispute, and the more it looked like preparation. Preparation for something bigger. Just after sunset, Earl Sutton stopped by. The old rancher climbed out of his pickup carrying a thermos. He didn't bother with small talk. "Heard Denise is after you." News traveled fast, apparently. Earl nodded toward the ranch road. "Same road your father fought over." I looked at him. "What road?" "The one crossing the West Pasture." That surprised me. The West Pasture Road barely got used anymore. Mostly ranch equipment and occasional maintenance trucks. Nothing important. At least that's what I thought. Earl seemed to read my expression. "You should ask yourself why developers keep wanting that road." Then he climbed back into his truck, just like that. No explanation, no details. Only another question. I watched his taillights disappear down the driveway. Then I went back inside and pulled out the old survey map again. The road Earl mentioned cut across the western section of the property before connecting with county land farther south. I stared at it for several minutes. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my ranch. I was looking at access, routes, connections, possibilities. And suddenly, Denise's obsession with my property felt a lot less random. Because if this was only about appearances, she wouldn't need newsletters. She wouldn't need assessments. She wouldn't need legal language hidden in fine print. She certainly wouldn't need my participation. No. She needed something else. Something my father had already refused to give away 30 years earlier. And somewhere inside the original Cedar Ridge documents, Grace believed she'd found the reason. Grace arrived at the ranch the following afternoon carrying a banker's box and a yellow legal pad. She skipped the small talk. That alone told me this mattered. We sat at the kitchen table. She pulled out a thick stack of photocopied documents. Cedar Ridge formation records, she said. I looked at the pile. That's what kept you up all night? No. She slid one document toward me. This is. I looked down. The paper was older than most of the houses inside Cedar Ridge. Original declaration. Filed with the county decades earlier. The document that legally created the HOA. Grace had highlighted a single paragraph. Nothing else. Just one section buried in the middle. I started reading. Halfway through, I stopped. Then I read it again. The language couldn't have been clearer. No authority of the association shall extend beyond the recorded subdivision boundary without written annexation consent executed by the affected property owner. I looked up. Grace nodded. Exactly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, because one paragraph had just destroyed everything Denise claimed. The inspections, the assessments, the compliance notices, the threats. Every bit of it depended on authority she didn't possess, and according to Cedar Ridge's own founding document, she couldn't possess it unless I signed an annexation agreement, which I never had. How certain are you? I asked. Grace almost laughed. Caleb, this isn't interpretation. She tapped the page. This is direct language. I looked at the highlighted clause again. No authority, no extension, no annexation, no consent. The entire fight suddenly felt different. Up until now, I had been defending my property. Now I knew something Denise apparently didn't. The law was already on my side. The question wasn't whether she was wrong. The question was why she kept pushing anyway. As if reading my thoughts, Grace opened another folder. I checked county records. And? No annexation filing exists. No surprise there. She shook her head. You don't understand. Grace pulled another document from the folder. Denise filed requests. That got my attention. What kind of requests? Information requests. She slid copies across the table. Over the last 2 years, someone connected to Cedar Ridge had repeatedly requested parcel maps involving land around my ranch. My ranch. The neighboring Sutton property. Several undeveloped tracts farther south. The pattern jumped off the page. Somebody inside Cedar Ridge had been studying land outside the subdivision. For years. Denise? Grace shrugged. Maybe. Who else? Could be board members. Developers? She didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't about barn colors. It never had been. The evidence was stacking up. Every document pointed in the same direction. Expansion. Access. Control. Grace slid one final page across the table. A formal response letter she'd drafted. Short. Professional, cold. No emotion. No threats. Just facts. The letter stated that Mercer Ranch was not part of Cedar Ridge Estates. No annexation agreement existed. No authority existed. No inspections would be permitted. Any future enforcement attempts would be documented and challenged. I read it twice. Perfect. When do we send it? Today. An hour later, I was standing at the county post office mailing the letter certified. I watched the clerk stamp the receipt. The sound felt strangely satisfying. Official. Permanent. Documented. Exactly the way Denise liked to operate. Now the paper trail worked both directions. By evening, she received it. I knew because my phone rang less than 30 minutes later. Denise Whitaker. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call came. then another, then an email. Subject line, Urgent Compliance Mater. I opened it. The message was shorter than her earlier notices, much shorter. Apparently my letter had reached a nerve. Mr. Mercer, Cedar Ridge reserves all rights regarding visual impacts affecting community value. Your refusal to cooperate may result in additional review procedures. No mention of annexation. No mention of authority. No mention of the clause. Interesting. I forwarded the email to Grace. Her response arrived less than 2 minutes later. She ignored the clause. Exactly. The next morning, another newsletter appeared. This one was worse. A photograph of my ranch entrance filled half the page. The article discussed protecting property values from adjacent landowners unwilling to support community standards. Again, no name. Again, no direct accusation. But everyone knew who she meant. The difference this time was that residents were starting to ask questions. I knew because 2 emails arrived from Cedar Ridge homeowners, people I had never met. Both asked the same thing. Is your ranch actually inside the HOA? I answered neither. Grace had already warned me. Do not argue publicly. Use documents. Not opinions, not emotions, documents. That afternoon she called again. Her tone sounded different, more cautious. Caleb. What now? I don't think Denise is backing down. I laughed. I figured that out. No. Grace paused. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. I think she's preparing a public inspection. The room went quiet. A what? A board inspection. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the ranch entrance. The gate sat closed. The chain hung exactly where it belonged. Can she do that? No, then why try? Grace exhaled slowly. Because people who know they're losing sometimes get reckless. I looked toward the road, toward the gate, toward the property Denise seemed obsessed with reaching. Then I remembered something. The board member taking photographs. The way they kept focusing on roads instead of buildings. The repeated references to impact, access, visibility. And for the first time, I had a feeling the next move wouldn't come through email. It would come through that gate. Grace was right. 3 days later, Denise Whitaker made her move. I knew before she even arrived. At 8:17 that morning, Earl Sutton called. Company's coming. That was all he said. Then he hung up. 20 minutes later, I saw them. 4 vehicles this time. Denise's white Range Rover, 2 board member SUVs, and a black pickup I didn't recognize. They stopped along the county road outside my gate. I stepped onto the porch and watched. No surprise, no panic, just curiosity. Because if Denise was willing to ignore her own HOA documents, I wanted to know how far she was prepared to go. The answer arrived when a man climbed out of the black pickup. Mid-50s, expensive boots, construction jacket, confident posture. He wasn't a resident. You could tell immediately. Residents showed up with questions. Developers showed up with plans. I had a feeling which one he was. A few seconds later, Denise confirmed it. She greeted him first. Not the board members. Not the homeowners gathering behind the vehicles. Him. Interesting. I grabbed my phone, started recording, then walked toward the gate. By the time I arrived, nearly a dozen people stood outside. Several residents. 3 board members, Denise, and the man from the pickup. The atmosphere felt different from the first confrontation. Less official, more theatrical, like Denise wanted an audience. Good morning, Caleb, she said. Morning. She smiled. Not warmly, performatively. We're conducting a community inspection. No, you're not. The smile remained. Several residents exchanged glances. Denise held up a folder. We're documenting visual impacts affecting Cedar Ridge property values. From the county road? Among other things. There it was. Among other things. The phrase caught my attention immediately, because it implied access, and access was exactly what she'd been denied. The man from the pickup stepped forward. Bradley Pike. He extended a hand through the gate. I ignored it. His hand slowly lowered. You're the developer. His eyebrows lifted. So you've heard of me? Only through county records. That got his attention. Denise quickly stepped between us. We're not here to discuss development. Which was an odd thing to say, considering nobody had mentioned development except her. The board members began taking photographs. Again, the barn, the pasture, the road, the gate, always the road. Never the hay, never the trailer, never the barn color she claimed to care about. Roads, access points, sight lines. I noticed every single shot. Grace would have noticed too. Denise launched into a speech about community standards. Nobody seemed particularly interested. Even some residents looked uncomfortable. One older homeowner finally raised a hand. Is his property actually in Cedar Ridge? The question hung in the air. Denise answered quickly. This inspection concerns adjacent impacts. Not yes. Not no. The resident frowned. So did several others. Then something happened. A mistake. The kind of mistake that changes a case. One board member, a tall guy in a green vest, walked toward the pedestrian side gate. He glanced at Denise. She didn't stop him. He reached over, lifted the latch, and stepped inside. 3 feet, maybe 4. Not far. Far enough. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. Every conversation stopped. I looked at him, then at Denise, then at my phone recording everything. You are on private property. My voice stayed calm. The board member froze, completely froze. For a split second, nobody moved. Not Denise, not Bradley Pike, not the residents. Nobody. Because everyone knew exactly what had happened. The man immediately stepped backward, back outside the gate, but the moment was already gone. Recorded, documented, permanent. Denise recovered first. We're documenting from the buffer area. The phrase sounded ridiculous even as she said it. I pointed toward the gravel. That's my driveway. Nobody argued. Not even her. The residents started whispering. Questions spread through the group. What buffer area? Why was he inside the gate? Wasn't this private property? Denise suddenly looked much less comfortable. Bradley Pike looked worse. He wasn't paying attention to the barn anymore. He was staring at the gate, at the road beyond it, at the ranch, calculating. That confirmed something I'd suspected for days. The ranch itself wasn't the prize. Something beyond the gate was. Denise ended the inspection 10 minutes later, far sooner than she'd planned. The crowd broke apart. Vehicles started leaving. Residents looked confused. The board members looked nervous. Only Bradley Pike seemed angry. As he climbed into his truck, he glanced once more toward the road cutting across the western side of my ranch. The same road Earl Sutton had mentioned. The same road my father had once fought to protect. Interesting. Very interesting. By noon, every piece of footage had been uploaded. Phone video, timestamps, photographs, and most importantly, footage from the trail camera mounted near the gate. The angle was perfect. The latch, the opening, the board member entering. Everything. Grace called less than 30 minutes after reviewing it. Her voice sounded calm, which usually meant somebody else should be worried. Congratulations. For what? Denise just turned a bad case into a good one. I smiled. That obvious? Caleb, she brought witnesses. The significance hit me immediately. Residents, board members, video, timestamps, documentation. An HOA representative had entered private property after authority had been denied in writing. Grace continued. I'm filing a county complaint. That got my attention. You think we're there already? We passed there 10 minutes after that gate opened. I looked out the kitchen window toward the ranch entrance. The chain hung exactly where it belonged. Closed, secure, unmoved. But everything had changed, because Denise came looking for evidence. Instead, she had created some, and I had a feeling the sheriff was about to become very interested in watching that footage. The call came the next morning, not from Denise, not from a lawyer, from the Harland County Sheriff's Office. Mr. Mercer? Speaking. This is Sheriff Nolan Reed. I understand there's a property dispute involving Cedar Ridge Estates. Property dispute. That was one way to describe it. I've got documentation, I said. I'd like to see it. Come to the ranch. I'll be there in an hour. The line went dead. Simple, professional. Exactly what I expected from Nolan Reed. I'd known of him for years, the kind of sheriff who preferred records over rumors and paperwork over speeches, which made him the worst possible audience for Denise Whitaker. I spent the next 40 minutes organizing everything: the deed, the parcel maps, the tax records, the HOA declaration, the certified letter Grace had sent, the newsletters, the assessment notices, the photographs, and most importantly, the footage. By the time Sheriff Reed's cruiser rolled onto the county road, my binder was waiting on the kitchen table. What surprised me wasn't that Reed arrived. It was who arrived 5 minutes later. Denise. Of course, the white Range Rover stopped behind the cruiser. A second SUV followed. 2 board members stepped out. Apparently somebody had warned her. Or maybe she'd been watching the county complaint system the same way she'd been watching my ranch. Either way, she was here. And she looked confident. That confidence lasted less than 15 minutes. We met near the gate. Sheriff Reed stood between us holding a notepad. Tall, calm, patient. The kind of man who never needed to raise his voice because everyone knew he didn't have to. Let's start simple, he said. I handed him the binder. Denise immediately opened her mouth. Sheriff, this is about community standards and... Reed raised one hand. Not aggressively. Just enough. I'll hear from you in a moment, Mrs. Whitaker. She stopped talking. Barely. Reed opened the binder. The first document was my deed. He read it. Then the parcel map. Then the tax records, then the HOA declaration. Nobody spoke. Even the board members seemed uncomfortable. Finally, Reed reached the highlighted clause. The same clause Grace had found. The same clause Denise kept pretending didn't exist. His eyes stopped moving. He read it once, then again. Then he looked up. Mrs. Whitaker. Denise straightened immediately. Yes, Sheriff? He held up the declaration. Do you have a signed annexation agreement for Mr. Mercer's property? The silence arrived instantly. Not confusion, not hesitation. Silence. Because everyone standing there knew the answer. Denise smiled. A practiced smile. The same smile she'd worn at the gate. Cedar Ridge has maintained an interest in adjacent appearance standards for years. Reed nodded. I didn't ask that. Her smile weakened. We have responsibilities regarding community value. I didn't ask that either. The board members suddenly became fascinated by the gravel under their boots. Reed repeated the question. Slowly. Do you have a signed annexation agreement? Denise looked toward the board members, then toward me, then back to Reed. We're reviewing historical records. That was lawyer language. Translation, no. Sheriff Reed closed the document. Then I handed him my phone. The footage started playing. The board inspection, the gate, the latch, the board member stepping onto my driveway, Denise talking about buffer zones, the residents asking questions. Everything. Nobody interrupted. When the video ended, Reed handed the phone back. His expression hadn't changed. That was worse for Denise than anger, because it meant he was evaluating facts, not personalities, not politics. Facts. He looked directly at her. Unless you have authority not presented here, your association representatives should not enter this property. Denise immediately pushed back. This is a civil matter. Reed nodded. Parts of it are. Then he pointed toward the gate. Entering private property after written notice has been denied creates a different issue. The confidence disappeared from her face. Not completely. Just enough. The board members exchanged nervous looks. For the first time since this started, Denise looked like someone realizing the script wasn't going according to plan. Reed spent another 20 minutes reviewing documents. Then he photographed the gate, the property signs, the entrance road, the parcel markers, everything. Before leaving, he handed me a case number. Keep documenting. Will do. Written communication only. I nodded. He turned toward Denise. Same advice. The sheriff left first. The board members followed shortly afterward. Only Denise remained. For a few seconds, she stood beside her SUV staring toward my ranch. Not the barn, not the trailer, not the hay storage. The road. Again. Always the road. Then she climbed into the Range Rover and drove away. I watched the vehicle disappear. The chain on the gate swayed slightly in the breeze. Still locked. Still mine. The immediate threat was gone. But something about the meeting bothered me. Not because Denise had lost, because she hadn't seemed surprised. Frustrated? Yes. Embarrassed? Absolutely. But not surprised. As if she already knew she couldn't answer the sheriff's question. As if the annexation agreement had never been the real objective. Later that evening, Grace called. I gave her a complete rundown of the meeting. She listened carefully, then asked one question. When Reed asked about the signature, how did Bradley Pike react? I stopped, because I hadn't been watching Denise. I'd been watching the developer. And now that I thought about it, Bradley Pike hadn't looked worried about annexation. He'd looked worried about something else entirely. The road. The same road he'd stared at during the inspection. The same road my father had refused to give away 30 years ago. Grace was quiet for several seconds. Then she said something that changed everything. Caleb, I think I know what they're really after. That sentence kept me awake most of the night. Not because Grace sounded uncertain, because she sounded certain. The next morning she arrived carrying a new folder. This one was thinner than the others, and somehow that made it more dangerous. We sat at the kitchen table. She opened the folder without speaking. Inside were county planning records, permit applications, engineering reviews, development maps, names I recognized. Cedar Ridge Estates, Bradley Pike Development Group, Harlan County Planning Department. I looked up. What am I looking at? Grace slid a map toward me. Phase 3. The map showed a proposed luxury expansion south of Cedar Ridge. Hundreds of acres, additional homes, private amenities, new construction. But one detail stood out immediately. A large section had been highlighted in red. What does that mean? Grace pointed to the notation. Requires secondary emergency access. I frowned. So county regulations require 2 access routes for developments of that size. The realization hit slowly. Then all at once. I looked back at the map. The proposed expansion sat behind hills and private parcels. Most of the surrounding land couldn't support a road. Too steep, too narrow, too expensive. Except one route, one obvious route. The line ran directly across Mercer Ranch, straight through the western pasture, straight across the road my father had protected. The same road Bradley Pike couldn't stop staring at. I leaned back. There it is. Grace nodded. There it is. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, because suddenly everything made sense. The inspections, the assessments, the newsletters, the fake authority. None of it had ever been about my barn, or my trailer, or my hay storage. Those were distractions. The real target was the road. If they could establish authority over the ranch, even partially, they could build a record, a paper trail, a foundation for future claims. Maybe not ownership, maybe not immediately, but influence, access, control. Exactly what my father warned about. People don't steal land first, they steal permission. Grace opened another document. This one was worse. An internal planning memo, obtained through a public records request. Most of the language was technical. Engineering reviews, traffic projections, emergency access discussions. Then I saw it. Alternative route dependent upon future cooperation with adjacent ownership. Adjacent ownership. That was me. I read the sentence again, then again. How old is this? 8 months. 8 months. Meaning Denise started targeting my ranch after these plans already existed. Not before. After. The sequence mattered, because it destroyed any argument that this was about community standards. The standards were an excuse. The road was the objective. Grace slid one final page across the table. A meeting summary. Bradley Pike's name appeared 3 times. Denise Whitaker's appeared twice. One section had been redacted. Another had not. Community outreach strategy regarding neighboring parcels. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because they had actually written it down. Community outreach. That was what they called harassment now. The more documents we reviewed, the uglier the picture became. Cedar Ridge needed access. Bradley Pike needed permits. The county required a second emergency route. Mercer Ranch contained the cheapest solution. And Denise had volunteered her HOA as the pressure tool. By noon, the story had changed completely. I wasn't defending a ranch anymore. I was standing in the way of a development project worth millions, which explained why Denise never backed down. The stakes were too high. That afternoon, another email arrived. Not from Denise. From a Cedar Ridge homeowner. Then another. Then a third. Word was spreading. Questions were spreading too. Residents wanted to know why HOA money was being spent fighting someone outside the HOA. Nobody seemed satisfied with Denise's answers. Good. The truth was finally moving. Around sunset, Earl Sutton stopped by again. This time I showed him the map. The old rancher studied it for less than 30 seconds. Then he smiled. The road. You knew? I suspected. You never said anything. Earl shrugged. Nobody believes an old rancher until the paperwork shows up. Fair point. He tapped the Western Access Road on the map. Your father rejected that route 30 years ago. I found the records. He said if they ever got that road, they'd never stop asking for more. The words settled heavily, because now I understood exactly what he'd meant. A road wasn't just a road. It was leverage, influence, future negotiations, future pressure, future expansion, and once granted, almost impossible to take back. Before leaving, Earl paused at the door. What's next? I looked at the growing stack of documents, the assessments, the newsletters, the county filings, the development maps, and finally the evidence showing what Denise really wanted. Then I answered honestly. They've spent months building their case. Earl nodded. And now? I smiled. Now we're building ours. The next morning, Grace called before sunrise. Her voice sounded energized, focused, the way it always did when she found something important. Caleb. What happened? We have a problem. I sat upright immediately. What kind of problem? The kind Denise Whitaker is about to have in a public hearing. I was fully awake now. What happened? I asked. Grace didn't waste time. Cedar Ridge posted an emergency board meeting agenda. And? The topic isn't your barn. I already knew that. It never was. Exactly. Papers shuffled on her end of the line. Then she read aloud. Discussion of legal response to hostile adjacent property owner and preservation of community access interests. I sat quietly for a moment. There it was. Not appearance standards, not visual compliance, not barn colors. Access interests. They had finally written it down. Not directly, not honestly, but enough. Grace continued. They're changing the language, because the old story stopped working. Exactly. The sheriff's visit had damaged them. The annexation clause had damaged them. The trespassing footage had damaged them. Now Denise needed a new justification, a new narrative, a new audience. The public hearing would be that audience. By noon, word was already spreading through Cedar Ridge. For weeks, Denise controlled the conversation through newsletters and board announcements. Now residents were comparing notes. Questions were multiplying. The first call came from a homeowner named Richard Hall. I'd never met him. He introduced himself immediately. Mr. Mercer, are you really outside the HOA? Yes. Completely? Completely. A long pause followed. Then why are we paying attorneys to go after you? That question made me smile, because it wasn't my question anymore. It was theirs. And that made all the difference. The second call came an hour later. The third came that evening. Different residents. Same concern. Same confusion. The facts were escaping Denise's control. Every homeowner who learned about the annexation clause seemed to ask the same thing. If he isn't in the HOA, why are we fighting him? Good question. The next morning, Grace and I attended the public portion of the emergency board meeting. The Cedar Ridge clubhouse was packed. Far more residents than Denise expected. That much was obvious. People weren't there to hear about landscaping. They were there because something felt wrong. Denise stood at the front of the room, confident, prepared, determined to regain control. A projector screen behind her displayed an enlarged photograph of my ranch. The same tactic again. Crop the image. Remove the context. Turn private property into a problem. She launched into a presentation. Property values, community interests, long-term planning, neighborhood standards. The words sounded polished, but something had changed. People weren't listening the way they used to. They were evaluating, questioning, comparing her claims against the facts they'd started hearing. Then Denise made a mistake. A big one. She clicked to the next slide. A map appeared. The western side of my ranch was highlighted. The access road was visible. Only for a second. Then she changed slides. Too late. I saw it. Several residents saw it too. The room shifted. Subtly, but unmistakably. The road had appeared. Not the barn. Not the trailer. The road. The real target. Question period started 10 minutes later. The first question came from a woman in the second row. Is Mr. Mercer's property part of Cedar Ridge? Denise smiled. The issue is more complex than… No, the woman interrupted. That's a yes or no question. The room got quiet. Very quiet. Denise hesitated, then answered carefully. No. A ripple moved through the audience. The second question followed immediately. If he's not in the HOA, why did we send him violation notices? No good answer. The third question came from the back. Did a board member enter his property? Another uncomfortable pause. The fourth question was worse. Why are HOA funds paying attorneys for land outside the HOA? Now people were talking openly, whispering, comparing information, looking at one another. The meeting was slipping away from Denise, and everyone could feel it. Then Earl Sutton stood up. I hadn't even realized he was there. The old rancher didn't raise his voice, didn't make a speech, didn't argue. He simply stated a fact. I knew Caleb's father. The room quieted. Earl continued. 30 years ago, developers wanted that same road. Every head turned toward Denise, toward the screen, toward the highlighted section that had flashed briefly earlier. Nobody interrupted him, because suddenly the story made sense. Not all of it, but enough. The meeting ended 15 minutes early, officially because the board had completed its agenda, unofficially because Denise was losing the room. Residents clustered in small groups afterward, asking questions, comparing timelines, requesting documents, demanding explanations, exactly the things Denise never wanted. Outside the clubhouse, Grace looked pleased. You see it? I nodded. The narrative shifted. She smiled. No. I looked at her. No? The ownership of the narrative shifted. That was even better. For weeks, Denise had been explaining me to Cedar Ridge. Now residents wanted Denise explained. As we walked toward the parking lot, my phone buzzed. An email notification. County Review Office. Subject line, Public Property Authority Review Hearing. I opened it, read it once, then handed it to Grace. The hearing date had been set, and for the first time since Denise rattled my gate, the entire fight was moving into a room where opinions didn't matter. Only records, only evidence, only signatures. The exact place where Denise Whitaker was weakest. The county review hearing took place 11 days later. By then, the story had spread far beyond Cedar Ridge. Not because of me, because of Denise. Every new newsletter, every new explanation, every new attempt to justify the HOA's actions created another question she couldn't answer. And all of those questions led to the same room. The hearing room wasn't impressive. A long table, county officials, a few rows of chairs, no cameras, no drama, just records. Which was exactly why Denise should have been worried. Opinions don't carry much weight in a room built around documentation. The room was already half full when Grace and I arrived. Several Cedar Ridge residents sat together near the back. Earl Sutton occupied a chair along the wall. Sheriff Nolan Reed stood quietly near the entrance speaking with a county employee. Then Denise arrived, alongside 2 board members, and Bradley Pike. That alone told me everything. If this had truly been about appearance standards, the developer wouldn't be there. But he was. Because this hearing was about something much larger than barn paint. The review officer, Marlene Foster, opened the proceedings at exactly 9 o'clock. She wasted no time. This review concerns claims of authority asserted by Cedar Ridge Estates over property owned by Caleb Mercer. Simple, direct, accurate. Denise stood first. She had prepared. That much was obvious. A stack of documents sat beside her. Photographs, newsletters, printed reports. She spent nearly 20 minutes discussing community interests, property values, neighborhood impact, visual preservation, and adjacent land concerns. The presentation sounded polished, professional, carefully rehearsed. The problem was that none of it answered the central question. Marlene let her finish, then asked, "What recorded authority permits Cedar Ridge Estates to regulate Mr. Mercer's property?" The room became very quiet. Denise smiled, the same smile she'd used from the beginning. "Cedar Ridge has maintained long-standing community influence over adjacent," Marlene interrupted. "That wasn't my question." The smile faded slightly. A few residents exchanged glances. Denise tried again. "Our board has consistently protected the interests of homeowners affected by neighboring." Again, Marlene interrupted. "What recorded authority? Not opinion, not custom, not preference. Authority." Denise looked toward the attorney seated beside the board. The attorney looked down at his notes. That wasn't a good sign. Grace stood. Without a word, she placed the original HOA declaration on the table, opened to the highlighted clause, the same clause that started changing everything weeks earlier. Marlene read it silently, then aloud. "No authority of the association shall extend beyond the recorded subdivision boundary without written annexation consent executed by the affected property owner." Several residents shifted in their seats, some hearing it for the first time, others hearing it confirmed. Grace then placed my deed beside the declaration, then the parcel map, then the certified correspondence, then the assessment notice. The hearing room slowly transformed from debate into evidence, one document at a time. Denise attempted another explanation. Grace didn't argue. She simply introduced the next exhibit, the $12,800 assessment, then the voluntary participation language, then the newsletters, then the inspection notices, then the trespass footage. The room watched in complete silence. Even Bradley Pike stopped pretending to take notes. Sheriff Reed eventually gave his statement. It lasted less than 5 minutes. No emotion, no opinions, just facts. He confirmed my property existed outside Cedar Ridge boundaries, confirmed no annexation agreement had been presented, confirmed HOA representatives entered private property after being denied authority. Then he sat down. The simplicity was devastating. Because facts don't require speeches. Finally, Marlene looked directly at Denise. One question. The same question Sheriff Reed had asked weeks earlier. The same question Grace had built the entire case around. The same question Denise had avoided every single time. "Mrs. Whitaker, where is the owner's signature?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the air seemed still. Denise looked at the declaration, then the deed, then the assessment, then the residents watching her. For the first time since this started, she had nowhere left to redirect the conversation. No community standards, no visual impacts, no buffer zones, no newsletters, no authority. Only one missing document. A document that didn't exist. Because I had never signed anything. The silence lasted nearly 10 seconds, long enough for every person in that room to understand exactly what it meant. Finally, Denise answered, "We do not currently possess a signed annexation agreement." The words landed like a hammer. Several residents lowered their heads. One board member closed his eyes. Bradley Pike stared straight ahead. Marlene nodded once, then wrote something in her file. I couldn't see what. I didn't need to. The case was over. Everyone in the room knew it. The only remaining question was how expensive the consequences were about to become. Marlene Foster returned from a short recess carrying a written determination. Nobody spoke as she sat down. Not Denise, not Bradley Pike, not the residents, not even Sheriff Reed. The room had already reached its conclusion. Now it was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Marlene adjusted her glasses and began reading. Cedar Ridge Estates possesses no recorded authority over the property owned by Caleb Mercer. The first sentence landed hard. Several residents immediately looked toward Denise. She kept her eyes on the table. Marlene continued. No annexation agreement exists. Another sentence. Another blow. The association's assessment notices, compliance demands, and inspection efforts were issued without legal authority. Grace didn't react. Neither did I. We had spent weeks building toward those exact words. Still, hearing them read into the record felt different. Official. Permanent. Final. Marlene turned a page. The proposed visual compliance assessment is declared void. There it was. The $12,800 demand that started everything. Gone. One sentence erased it. But Marlene wasn't finished. Cedar Ridge Estates shall immediately cease all enforcement efforts directed toward Mercer Ranch. Another page. All references implying HOA authority over Mercer Ranch shall be withdrawn. Another page. The association shall issue written corrections to residents regarding the status of Mercer Ranch as a non-member property. This time, several residents nodded. Some looked relieved. Others looked angry. Mostly at Denise. The room had shifted completely. Weeks earlier, residents viewed me as a problem. Now they were discovering they had been used as an audience. Marlene finished with one final directive. All communications relating to enforcement attempts against Mercer Ranch shall be preserved and made available for county review upon request. That one hit Denise hardest, because it meant the paper trail wasn't disappearing. Every newsletter, every notice, every assessment, every email, preserved, recorded, reviewable. Exactly the way she'd wanted to operate from the beginning. The hearing ended 10 minutes later. No dramatic speeches, no shouting, no celebration. Just signatures, paperwork, and consequences. Outside the building, residents gathered in small groups. Questions started immediately. Not for me, for Denise, legal costs, board decisions, development plans, assessment notices. Nobody seemed interested in hearing about community standards anymore. They wanted answers. Real answers. Bradley Pike left first. Fast. No conversations. No explanations. Just straight to his truck. That told me everything I needed to know. Developers walk away quickly when a plan stops making money. Denise stayed longer. Long enough to realize nobody was following her. Long enough to realize she no longer controlled the story. Then she left too. For the first time since she rattled my gate, she looked small. Not defeated, just exposed. A person standing where authority used to be. Grace watched her leave. That's not the end of her problem. I knew. Neither of us needed to say more. The residents would take care of the rest. 3 days later, the correction letter arrived. Official Cedar Ridge letterhead. Official Cedar Ridge signature. Official Cedar Ridge admission. The language was careful, almost painfully careful. Mercer Ranch is not part of Cedar Ridge Estates. Previous communications may have created confusion regarding the association's authority over the property. May have created confusion. I laughed. Weeks of threats, assessments, inspections, and now it was confusion. I called Grace. She laughed too, then told me to keep the letter, as if I planned to throw it away. The following week brought more news. A special HOA board meeting, emergency budget review, questions regarding legal expenses, questions regarding enforcement actions, questions regarding board leadership. Residents were finally asking the questions Denise spent weeks avoiding. The answers weren't helping her. 2 weeks later, the announcement became official. Denise Whitaker was stepping down as HOA president. The letter called it a leadership transition. Nobody I knew called it that. Earl Sutton called me the same afternoon. The map won. That was all he said. Then he laughed and hung up. A month after the hearing, life finally became quiet again. Real quiet. The kind I'd wanted from the beginning. No newsletters, no assessments, no inspections, no strange vehicles outside the gate. One Saturday morning, I replaced the old chain on the entrance, installed a stronger latch, checked the hinges, tightened the bolts. Simple work, honest work, the kind that makes sense. Before finishing, I mounted one final sign beside the gate. Nothing fancy, just black lettering on brushed metal. Private ranch. Recorded boundaries matter. I stepped back and looked at it. The sign wasn't authority. The deed was authority. The survey was authority. The records were authority. The sign was only a reminder. For people who confuse visibility with ownership, for people who mistake influence for jurisdiction, for people who think enough paperwork can eventually become truth. Late that evening, I stood on the porch overlooking 900 acres my family had protected for decades. The western road stretched toward the hills, still mine, still private, still exactly where my father intended it to be. I thought about the first morning, the rattling chain, the inspection demand, the threats, the fake assessment, the sheriff, the hearing, the missing signature. Every step had followed the same pattern. Someone wanted permission. They just didn't want to ask for it honestly. My father had seen it 30 years earlier. I'd seen it now. And the lesson hadn't changed. People don't steal land first. They steal permission. The mistake Denise Whitaker made was believing permission could be manufactured. A deed proved otherwise. A map proved otherwise. And in the end, 900 acres of Wyoming ranch land proved otherwise too. The road stayed quiet after that. Exactly the way I liked it. Exactly the way it should have been from the start.
If there's one lesson I took from all of this, it's that boundaries only mean something where you're willing to understand them, document them, and stand by them. The most important that protected my ranch wasn't the gates, the change, or even the road. It's what the paperwork my father kept, the records that told the truth, and the patience to let the facts speak when emotions were running high. Sometimes the strongest response isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's simply knowing where you stand and refusing to step away from it. There's something comforting about that. In a world where people move fast and make assumptions, the truth still matters. A deed matters, a shooter matters, and honest people who take the time to do things the right way still matter. That's not just about land ownership. It's about respecting limits, respecting others, and respecting the truth even when it's inconvenient. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand your ground over something that was rightfully yours? Maybe it's worth property, a family matter, a business issue, or simply a principle you believe in. If you would have done the same thing Caleb did, type yes in the comments, and if you ever deal with an HOA, rub the word trusted so we can see how many folk have been there too. And if you enjoy a story about ordinary people using patience, evidence, and common sense to protect what matters, consider subscribing. There are plenty more stories like this waiting down the road, and I'd be glad to help you along for the journey.